The silk strap of my sundress betrayed me, slithering off my shoulder just as I faced the mirror. Frozen, I grappled with my bra, the faint creak of the bedroom door slicing through the silence. I whirled around. Josh, my stepson. He stood framed in the doorway, his hand still gripping the knob. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. "Didn't mean to interrupt," he finally murmured, his voice low, hesitant. "You shouldn't be here," I stammered, yanking the strap back into place, heat flooding my cheeks at the humiliation of being caught like this. But he didn't leave. He stayed rooted there, his gaze flicking from the fallen strap to my face, an unreadable expression tightening his features. "Josh," I said sharply, breaking the strained quiet. "Right," he muttered, finally retreating, the door clicking shut behind him. I sank onto the edge of the bed, my hands trembling, trying to steady my breath. It was an accident, I told myself. Just a clumsy moment we'd both pretend never happened. But even as I thought it, I couldn't erase the way his eyes had lingered, the sudden thickness of the air in that fleeting second. Later, when I ventured out, Josh was in the kitchen, casually scrolling on his phone like nothing had occurred. But when his eyes met mine across the room, I knew. Whatever invisible line had existed between us was gone, obliterated. 10 years ago, I married Richard. He was older, established, offering the stability I desperately craved after my first marriage imploded. His charm was subtle, his demeanor controlled, and his promises of a serene, predictable life were enough to convince me it was what I needed. Our house, a sprawling modern place nestled in Westchester County, became my kingdom, but also, I realized, my gilded cage. Richard's job as a corporate consultant meant he was almost always gone. At first, I filled the void with charity events, book clubs, and endless renovations. But over time, the distractions faded. The house grew quieter, the echoes of my own thoughts louder. Then Josh moved in. After college, it was supposed to be temporary, Richard said, just a few months until Josh found his footing in the cutthroat New York job market. I hadn't seen him much since Richard and I married. He'd lived with his mother Karen out in California. I wasn't prepared for the man who walked through our front door. He wasn't the awkward teenager I vaguely remembered from our first strained meeting. At 24, he was tall, radiating a quiet confidence, the kind that drew attention without effort. His dark hair was perpetually tousled, his sharp blue eyes missing nothing. He moved with an easy grace Richard never possessed, his humor quick, never cruel. At first, I dismissed it as my imagination. The way he'd linger in the kitchen while I cooked, the way he'd lean against the counter, asking about my day as if he genuinely cared. But slowly, I started noticing other things. The way his gaze held a beat too long when I entered a room, the subtle softening of his voice when he spoke to me, the way he always seemed to find reasons to be near. The sundress incident changed everything. It wasn't just the moment itself, the raw intimacy of being caught so vulnerable. It was the electric charge that crackled between us afterward. Josh didn't mention it, neither did I. But the tension thickened, unspoken, undeniable. One evening, a week or so later, we were in the living room, the TV murmuring in the background. Ignored. I was pretending to read, Josh scrolling on his phone. "You ever feel like this place is too big?" he asked abruptly. I looked up, startled. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, eyes still glued to his phone. "Just feels empty sometimes. Like it's meant for more people." I set my book down, studying him. "You didn't grow up here. It's always been like this for me." He glanced up then, his gaze locking with mine. "Doesn't it get lonely?" His question hung in the air, and for a moment I didn't know how to answer. "Sometimes," I admitted finally. Josh nodded, as if he'd already known. "Me too." Richard called later that night, his voice distant, preoccupied as usual. "Extra 2 days for meetings," he said, leaving the house to just Josh and me. After hanging up, I drifted into the kitchen to make tea. Josh was already there, leaning against the counter, a glass of water in hand. "Late call from Richard?" he asked, his tone casual. "Another extension," I said with a shrug. Josh smirked. "Does he even live here anymore?" The question stung more than I expected. "Work is important to him," I said, the words hollow even to my own ears. "Must be nice," Josh replied, his voice soft but sharp. "To be so busy you don't notice what's happening right in front of you." I frowned, unsure of his meaning. "What are you talking about?" Josh stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "Nothing," he said after a beat, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "Just thinking out loud." But the weight of his words lingered long after he left the room. The next day, I found myself in the garden, pruning the roses that lined the stone path. Josh appeared behind me, his footsteps light as he joined me. "Need help?" he asked, his voice easy. I glanced at him, surprised. "You know anything about gardening?" "Not a thing," he admitted, grinning. I handed him the shears anyway, guiding him as he awkwardly trimmed a few branches. His hands were steady, his movements precise as he followed my instructions. "This is kind of relaxing," he said after a while. I laughed softly. "Better than staring at your phone all day." "Much," he said, his gaze meeting mine. The moment stretched, and I felt that now familiar flutter of tension between us. I looked away first, my cheeks warming under his steady gaze. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about Josh. The way he moved through the house, the way he looked at me, the way he seemed to see through every carefully constructed wall I'd built. I told myself it was nothing, just an overactive imagination fueled by too much time alone. But deep down, I knew better. Josh wasn't a boy anymore, and whatever was happening between us wasn't something I could ignore. The tension had become a living thing, simmering in every conversation, lingering in every glance. I told myself it was just loneliness. Too much quiet house, too much time with him. But the truth was harder, sharper. Something had shifted, and neither of us seemed willing or able to stop it. The breaking point arrived one quiet evening. The house was dim, the only light spilling from a corner lamp in the living room. I was curled on the couch with a book, a glass of wine beside me, while Josh sat on the floor, leaning against the coffee table, scrolling on his phone. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked suddenly, shattering the silence. I looked up, startled. "Regret what?" "Marrying my dad," he said, his tone casual, but a sharp edge to his words tightened my chest. I hesitated, unsure how to answer. "Why would you ask that?" He shrugged, setting his phone down. "Just curious, you don't seem happy." His words hung in the air, cutting deeper than I wanted to admit. "Marriage isn't always about happiness," I said finally. "What's it about then?" "Stability, partnership, building a life together." Josh's lips curved into a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Sounds more like a business deal." I didn't respond. The truth of his observation stung. The next day, the tension finally snapped. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up after lunch when Josh walked in. He moved to the sink, washing his hands as I wiped down the counters. "I didn't mean to upset you last night," he said suddenly, his voice quiet. "You didn't," I replied, though my tone was sharper than intended. He turned to face me, his expression earnest. "You don't have to pretend with me, Sarah." I froze, breath catching. "What do you mean?" I see it," he said, stepping closer. "The way you keep everything bottled up, the way you're always trying to hold it together." I shook my head, stepping back. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" he asked, his gaze steady. "You deserve more than this, more than him." His words hit like a punch. I opened my mouth to retort, but no sound came. Before I could think, before I could stop myself, I blurted out, "Josh, you can't say things like that." "Why not?" he asked, his voice soft, insistent. "Because it's wrong, or because it's true?" The first time it happened, it was almost an accident. We were in the library, the door closed behind us as we sorted through old photo albums. Richard had asked me to organize them. I was sitting on the floor, surrounded by stacks of pictures, while Josh leaned against the desk, flipping through an album. "Your dad was handsome when he was younger," I said, pointing to a photo of Richard in his 20s. Josh smirked. "You mean he peaked early?" I laughed, shaking my head. "Don't be mean." He looked up then, his gaze lingering on me for a beat too long. "You're beautiful, you know that." The compliment caught me off guard, my cheeks warming. "Josh?" "I mean it," he said, his voice lower now. "You're incredible." I should have stopped him, laughed it off, changed the subject, done anything but what I did next. Instead, I met his gaze, my heart hammering, seeing the raw sincerity in his eyes. And then he was kneeling in front of me, his hand brushing against my cheek. "Tell me you don't feel it too," he whispered. I couldn't. The days that followed were a blur of heightened senses and stolen moments. Every interaction felt like walking a tightrope, the thrill of what we were doing laced with the constant thrum of fear. We were careful, always scanning for prying eyes. But the secrecy only intensified the forbidden pull between us. One evening, as the sun bled across the Hudson, painting the sky in fiery hues, we found ourselves in the garden. The air was warm, thick with the scent of roses. Josh reached for my hand, his touch gentle, yet firm. "This can't last," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Then let's make the most of it," he said, his gaze unwavering. The first crack in our fragile secret came from an unexpected source. Mike, Josh's closest friend from college. He stopped by one afternoon, his easy charm masking a subtle sharpness that made me instantly uneasy. "Nice setup you've got here," Mike said, sprawling on the edge of the couch, his eyes flicking around the living room, taking everything in. "We like it," I replied, forcing a smile. Mike's gaze lingered on me for a beat too long before turning to Josh. "You're lucky," he said, his tone light yet pointed. "Not everyone gets to come back to this." Josh tensed beside me, his posture stiffening. "Mike, don't." "Don't what?" Mike asked, feigning innocence. "Just making an observation." The conversation shifted after that, but the unease in the room didn't dissipate. Later that night, Josh found me in the kitchen, his expression tight. "He knows something," he said, his voice low. "Mike?" My stomach clenched. Josh nodded. "He's not stupid. And Mike's always been nosy." "What do we do?" I asked, the weight of our precarious situation pressing down. Josh stepped closer, his hand brushing mine. "We keep quiet. He doesn't have proof." I nodded, but the knot in my stomach remained. Secrets, I was learning, had a way of attracting complications, and ours was no exception. It wasn't long before the fragile world Josh and I had constructed began to crumble. The first complication solidified in the form of Mike. His casual visits became more frequent, his jokes laced with an uncomfortable edge, his easy grin too knowing. He appeared at the door unannounced one Saturday afternoon, a six-pack of craft beer in hand and that smirk plastered on his face. Josh had been helping me reorganize the bookshelves in the library, his usual playful energy making the tedious task almost enjoyable. "Looks cozy in here," Mike drawled as he sauntered in, his sharp eyes taking in the scene. Josh and me amidst piles of books, a comfortable intimacy hanging in the air. "Mike," Josh said, his voice tight with surprise. "What are you doing here?" "Thought I'd swing by," Mike replied, leaning casually against the doorframe. "Catch up. Maybe didn't realize you were so busy." I forced a brittle smile, stepping back from the bookshelves, trying to create some space. "We were just finishing up." Mike's gaze flicked between us, a flicker of amusement dancing in his eyes. Didn't mean to interrupt. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. I excused myself abruptly, retreating to the kitchen, needing to escape. But even from there, I could hear their conversation. Mike's teasing tone, Josh's clipped responses, the subtle undercurrent of suspicion humming beneath their words. Later that evening, Josh found me staring out the kitchen window, my reflection a ghost against the darkening glass. His expression was tight. "Mike's nosy," he said, his voice low. "He's your friend," I replied, though the unease in my chest mirrored his. "That doesn't mean he doesn't notice things," Josh said, running a hand through his hair. "He knows me too well." What do you think he suspects?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Josh hesitated, the silence stretched taut. Enough to be dangerous. The second complication arrived in the polished form of Jessica, Richard's business partner. Her sharp wit and unnerving curiosity made her an unwelcome presence in my carefully constructed life. Jessica had always been more deeply entwined in Richard's affairs than I was comfortable with. She had a way of making herself indispensable, her loyalty to him bordering on something else. "You look tired, Sarah," Jessica said one afternoon, her voice sharp, as she breezed into the house to drop off some documents for Richard. I forced a smile, trying to dismiss her comment. "It's been a busy week." "Busy with what?" she asked, her gaze too intent. "Just the usual," I replied, though the weight of her scrutiny made my pulse quicken. Jessica's lips curved into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Richard's lucky to have you holding things down at home. Not everyone could handle it." The subtle insinuation in her tone wasn't lost on me, and a cold finger of unease traced its way down my spine. Jessica was the type to dig, to unearth what was hidden, and her presence felt like a direct threat to the delicate balance of my secret world. I couldn't afford to ignore her. After that, the walls started closing in. Mike's visits became more frequent, his jokes sharper, his observations too pointed. Jessica's questions grew more direct, her appearances at the house less about business, more about surveillance. One evening, as I stood in the garden, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows, pruning roses, Jessica materialized unexpectedly at the edge of the stone path. "Beautiful flowers," she said, her voice startling me. I turned, Shears clutched in my hand to find her standing there, arms crossed, a predator assessing its prey. "Jessica," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "I didn't hear you come in." "Richard asked me to drop off some contracts," she said, her tone deceptively casual. "Thought I'd check the garden while I was here. It's always so peaceful out here." I forced a smile, though my hands trembled slightly as I set down the shears. "It is one of my favorite places." Jessica stepped closer, her gaze flicking towards the living room window where Josh stood, watching us. "Josh has grown into quite the young man, hasn't he?" My chest tightened. "He has." She tilted her head, studying me with an unnerving intensity. "You seem close." "We've had more time to spend together lately," I said, keeping my tone light, non-committal. "Must be nice," Jessica replied, her smile sharp, like broken glass. Not everyone gets that kind of connection with their stepchildren. The turning point, the moment when everything began to unravel with terrifying speed, came during a dinner party at our house. Richard, in a rare display of social enthusiasm, had insisted on hosting, leaving me scrambling to prepare. Mike and Jessica were both on the guest list, their presence an unwelcome reminder of the precariousness of my situation. Throughout the evening, I felt their eyes on me, their subtle remarks and probing questions like tiny needles pricking my skin. "You and Josh make quite the team," Mike said at one point, his tone deceptively light, but his gaze piercing. "Josh has been a big help," I replied, forcing a smile that felt brittle on my face. "Must be nice having him around," Jessica added, her gaze sharp as a hawk's. "Especially with Richard gone so often." "Often?" I felt the blood drain from my face, but before I could formulate a response, Richard materialized beside me, his hand heavy on my shoulder. "Sarah keeps everything running smoothly," he said, his tone warm, possessive. For a fleeting moment, the tension in the room felt unbearable, suffocating, the weight of their scrutiny crushing me. After the guests finally departed, leaving a trail of half-empty wine glasses and lingering unease, Josh found me in the kitchen, his expression a volatile mix of anger and concern. "They're trying to trap you," he said, his voice low and tight. "I know," I replied, my hands trembling as I rinsed dishes under the faucet, the clatter echoing in the strained silence. "We need to be more careful," he said, stepping closer, the heat of his body radiating towards me. I turned to face him, my chest aching, constricting. "Josh, this can't go on." His gaze softened, his eyes searching mine, and he reached for my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine. "I won't let them ruin this," he said, his voice filled with a fierce conviction that resonated deep within me. "I won't let them ruin us." The raw certainty in his voice was enough to steady me, to momentarily quell the rising panic, but the unease in my chest lingered, a cold premonition. As the days bled into weeks, the cracks in our carefully constructed secret widened. Mike's probing questions, Jessica's veiled remarks, Richard's oblivious presence, it all coalesced into a sense of impending doom, a ticking time bomb set to detonate. I couldn't shake the feeling that our time was running out. It started subtly, as betrayals often do. A misplaced glance, a question asked with too much casual interest, a moment of silence stretched too long. But small cracks have a way of widening, of spiderwebbing across the surface until the whole structure threatens to shatter. And before I even realized it, the walls were closing in, the air growing thin. The first major tremor hit when Richard confronted me about my behavior. It was late, the house hushed and still. I was in the bedroom, brushing my hair in front of the mirror when Richard walked in. His tie was loosened around his neck, the faint, familiar scent of scotch clinging to him. "You've been distant lately," he said, his tone even, carefully controlled but laced with an undercurrent of suspicion that sent a shiver down my spine. I paused, meeting his gaze in the mirror. "I don't know what you mean." "You've been distracted," he pressed, stepping closer, his reflection looming behind mine. "Is something going on? Something I should know about?" My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage, but I forced myself to remain outwardly calm, my voice steady. "I've just been busy. The house, the garden, it's a lot to manage." Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, his gaze fixed on mine. "Is that all it is?" "Of course," I said, turning to face him, trying to project an air of innocent sincerity. "What else would it be?" He studied me for another long, agonizing moment, his silence more unnerving than any accusation. Finally, he nodded, a curt, dismissive gesture. "I hope you're not keeping anything from me, Sarah. You know how important honesty is to me." His words hung in the air, a veiled threat, a stark warning. I forced a smile, my stomach churning with a cold dread as he turned and left the room, the unspoken question hanging heavy between us. Things escalated quickly after that. A week later, I walked into the kitchen to find Jessica already there, her phone casually placed on the counter as she poured herself a glass of water. "Hope you don't mind," she said, glancing over her shoulder, a practiced air of nonchalance about her. I let myself in. "I wasn't expecting you," I replied, my tone sharper than I intended. "I had some documents for Richard," she said, her gaze flicking towards the living room where Josh sat hunched over his laptop, engrossed in something on the screen. "I thought I'd drop them off." Her eyes lingered on Josh for a beat too long before she turned back to me, a faint, knowing smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. "He's quite the presence, isn't he?" I asked, feigning ignorance, trying to keep my voice light. "Ethan," she said, her tone deliberately casual, yet pointed. "He's grown up a lot since I last saw him." "You must be proud," she finished, her eyes locking with mine. "Of course," I said, my pulse quickening, the subtle interrogation making my skin crawl. Jessica's smile widened, but it remained cold, predatory. "It's nice, isn't it? Having him around must make the house feel a little less empty." Her words sent a chill straight through me, a stark, undeniable confirmation that she was watching, that she suspected. I forced a laugh, a hollow, brittle sound that echoed in the spacious kitchen. "It's been a change, that's for sure." That evening, as Josh and I sat in the library, the silence heavy with unspoken anxieties, I recounted my unsettling encounter with Jessica. "She's watching us," I said, my voice trembling slightly, the weight of her veiled accusations pressing down. "She doesn't know anything," Josh replied, his tone firm, reassuring, but I could see the flicker of worry in his eyes. "She suspects something," I insisted, my voice rising slightly. "And Mike isn't helping. He's been poking around too much." Josh leaned forward, his gaze intense, unwavering. "We'll deal with them, together." I desperately wanted to believe him, to cling to the strength in his voice, the determination in his eyes. But the weight of our situation felt heavier with each passing day, the noose tightening. The breaking point, the moment when the carefully constructed facade finally shattered, came when Mike cornered me at a neighborhood event. Richard, in a misguided attempt to project an image of domestic harmony, had insisted we attend. The evening had been strained from the start, the forced smiles and polite small talk masking a palpable tension. Jessica hovered nearby, her watchful presence a constant reminder of the precariousness of our secret. And my Ike's gaze, sharp and knowing, followed me relentlessly throughout the evening, a silent predator circling its prey. I slipped outside onto the patio for a breath of fresh air, desperate to escape the suffocating atmosphere of forced gaiety. Mike appeared moments later, his grin sharp, predatory, his eyes glinting with an unsettling mix of amusement and malice. "Enjoying the party?" he asked, his tone deceptively casual, but his eyes held a hard, knowing edge. "It's fine," I replied, my voice clipped, trying to keep my composure from crumbling. Mike stepped closer, closing the space between us, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "You know, you're not as subtle as you think you are." My breath caught in my throat, but I forced myself to meet his gaze, to maintain a semblance of control. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play dumb, Sarah," he said, his grin widening, revealing a flash of teeth. "I see the way you and Josh look at each other. I've seen enough to know what's going on." "You're imagining things," I said, my voice trembling despite my efforts to keep it steady. "Am I?" he asked, his tone mocking, his eyes raking over me with a disturbing intensity. "Because I've got a pretty damn good imagination." Before I could formulate a response, before I could deny or deflect or escape, Richard appeared, his expression unreadable, his presence a sudden, jarring intrusion. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice laced with an undercurrent of suspicion. "Just making conversation," Mike said smoothly, his smirk never fading, his gaze still holding mine captive. Richard's gaze shifted between us, a flicker of unease, of suspicion igniting in his eyes. "Sarah, can I talk to you for a moment?" "Of course," I said, my heart pounding against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear. I followed Richard back inside, leaving Mike standing alone on the patio, his knowing smirk burning into my back. Richard's confrontation that night was quieter, more controlled than I'd anticipated, but no less devastating. "You and Mike seemed awfully tense out there," he said, his tone measured, carefully neutral, but the underlying suspicion was unmistakable. Mike was being inappropriate, I said, my voice steady despite the rising panic clawing at my throat. Inappropriate? Richard frowned, his brow furrowing. How? He made a comment about Josh, I said, choosing my words with excruciating care, threading a fragile narrative of plausible deniability. Something about how close we've become. Richard's frown deepened, his eyes hardening. And what did you say? I told him he was imagining things, I replied, meeting his gaze directly, praying he wouldn't see the tremor of fear beneath the surface. Richard studied me for another long, agonizing moment, his silence amplifying the suffocating tension in the room. Finally, he nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. Good. I won't have anyone spreading rumors about this family. His words offered a momentary reprieve, a fragile shield against the encroaching storm. But I knew, with a chilling certainty, that it was only a matter of time before the rumors became a deafening roar, impossible to ignore, impossible to deny. The final, crushing blow came when Jessica revealed her hand, when the veiled threats and subtle insinuations gave way to open, calculated malice. She stopped by the house one afternoon, her usual polished charm replaced by a quiet, unsettling intensity that set every nerve in my body on edge. I thought you should know, she began, her voice calm, almost clinical, but firm, unwavering, that Mike has been talking. A lot. What are you talking about? I asked, my stomach twisting into a knot of dread, the air suddenly thick and suffocating. About you and Josh, she said, her gaze unwavering, her eyes cold and assessing. He said there's something inappropriate going on between you and Richard's son. I froze, the blood draining from my face, my mind racing, desperately trying to find an escape route from this suffocating trap. I don't know if it's true, Jessica continued, her voice devoid of warmth, devoid of any hint of sympathy. But Richard won't take it well if he hears it from someone else. I stood there paralyzed, the weight of her words crushing me. Why are you telling me this? I finally managed to whisper, my voice barely audible. Because I don't want to see this family fall apart, Jessica said. Though her tone was utterly devoid of sincerity, her words a thinly veiled threat, a final, devastating warning. I knew then, with absolute certainty, that our time was up. The storm was about to break. The storm finally erupted on a quiet evening, the deceptive calm before the cataclysm. The house was still, eerily silent, save for the faint hum of the dishwasher in the kitchen and the soft, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I had been pretending to read, my eyes scanning the same line of text over and over, the words blurring into meaningless shapes, my mind a chaotic whirlwind of fear and anticipation. Then Richard walked in. His expression was sharper, harder, more unforgiving than I had ever seen it. "Sarah," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, chillingly devoid of warmth. "We need to talk." My stomach plummeted, a sickening lurch. I closed the book, setting it aside, my hands trembling slightly. What is it? Richard remained standing, rigid and unyielding, his gaze cold, calculating, dissecting me. "Jessica told me something disturbing today," he said, each word precise, deliberate, like a hammer blow. "Something about you and Josh." The air seemed to leave my lungs in a rush, leaving me breathless, suffocating. But I forced myself to maintain a neutral expression, to project an outward calm I was far from feeling. "What did she say?" "She said Mike has been spreading rumors," Richard replied, his voice hardening, taking on a sharp, accusatory edge. "He claims there's something inappropriate going on between you and my son." I stood, my legs suddenly weak, trembling beneath me. "That's absurd," I managed to say, my voice shaking despite my efforts to control it. "Mike has always been jealous of Josh. He's trying to cause trouble." Richard crossed his arms, his gaze narrowing, his skepticism palpable. "Then why would Jessica feel the need to warn me? Why would Mike even think he could say something like that?" "I don't know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, my carefully constructed defenses crumbling around me. "But it's not true." Richard stepped closer, his presence looming over me, suddenly menacing, towering. "Look me in the eye, Sarah," he demanded, his voice low, dangerous, "and tell me you haven't crossed any lines." I opened my mouth to deny it, to swear it wasn't true, but the words wouldn't come. My silence hung between us, heavy, damning, a silent confession. At that precise, devastating moment, Josh appeared in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes wide with alarm, but his jaw set with a fierce determination. Leave her alone, he said, his voice firm, unwavering, cutting through the suffocating tension. Richard turned, his eyes narrowing, focusing his fury on his son. So it's true? He hissed, his voice laced with betrayal. No, Josh said quickly, vehemently, stepping forward, placing himself between Richard and me, a protective shield. But you're harassing her over some ridiculous rumor. She doesn't deserve this. Don't lie to me, Josh. Richard snapped, his voice rising, losing its carefully controlled veneer. I know when someone is hiding something. Josh squared his shoulders, meeting his father's furious gaze head on. And I know when someone is looking for a scapegoat. You're never here, Dad. You have no idea what goes on in this house. Richard's face flushed crimson, his fists clenching at his sides, his control finally snapping. Don't you dare lecture me about this family. This family? Josh shot back, his voice rising to match his father's fury. You don't care about this family. You only care about control. You've ignored Sarah for years, and now you're acting shocked that she might find comfort elsewhere. Josh, I said sharply, pleadingly, trying to stop the escalating confrontation, but it was too late. The dam had broken. Richard turned back to me, his expression a terrifying mask of fury and betrayal. So it's true, he repeated, his voice low, venomous, the accusation hanging in the air like a death sentence. The confrontation spiraled out of control with terrifying speed. Richard shouted accusations, fueled by rage and wounded pride. Josh hurled back truths, raw and unfiltered, exposing the hollowness at the core of Richard's carefully constructed world. And I stood frozen in the middle of the maelstrom, a silent witness to the destruction, unable to stop the chaos. Finally, Richard pointed towards the door, his hand trembling with barely suppressed rage. Get out, he said to Josh, his voice low, venomous, each word dripping with poison. You're no longer welcome in this house. You can't do that, I said, stepping between them, my voice shaking, pleading. Richard's gaze turned to me, cold, unyielding, utterly devoid of warmth. You can go with him, Sarah, he said, his voice flat, final. If this is the life you've chosen, then you've made your decision. Without another word, Josh grabbed my hand, his grip firm, pulling me towards the door, away from the wreckage. Let's go, he said, his voice softer now, gentler, but filled with a quiet resolve. I hesitated, my heart breaking, tearing in two as I looked back at Richard one last time, at the man I had once promised to spend my life with. But his face was stone, his eyes cold, his love for me extinguished, replaced by a burning anger, a bitter disgust. I turned away, tears blurring my vision, and walked out the door, leaving behind the life I had so carefully, so painstakingly built, stepping into the uncertain promise, the terrifying unknown of what lay ahead.